Okay, what I want to do is I want to expand on what I mentioned last time, which is this whole issue of the impacts of European colonialism in an area where the Europeans don't really see a lot of value in the area. So it's more ego than actual resource extraction. I mean, think of someplace like India, between the resources there, excuse me, resources that are there, then and just sort of this huge population labor base that's pretty well educated, etc. The British, the French, everyone competes for control of that area because they basically can see, they can see very clearly how they can make a lot of money out of it. Most of sub-Saharan Africa, like Oceania, falls into another category, which is, you want it because you don't want it because there's anything there of value as you see it. You want it because you don't want to let someone else have it. So it's sort of like, I guess, being a miser, or being a hoarder. You want to hoard as much of the world as possible so that you don't have to share it. So once you've got it, you sort of put it in your garage or something like that, and you don't really, not really interested. You're not going to spend time on it. You just want it. Excuse me. Story. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa here, as the Europeans start to expand in their colonial period, 1500s, the Spanish and the Portuguese are the first ones out of the gates. Portuguese decide to go this way. So the Portuguese go down the coast of Africa and go this way and end up in India, because of course everyone's trying to figure out how to get to China. Of course, the Spanish are going this way across the Atlantic. The Portuguese set up colonies here in the south part of Africa. Again, as with South America, there's horrendous weather getting around the southern Cape of South Africa. And so it's really deadly, very dangerous. And so you basically need to make sure that ships are going to be in good shape when they get there, and ships can repair themselves after they make the trip, hoping they don't sink. And so what happens is the Portuguese set up stations here, basically like service stations, repair depots. But they don't really spend a lot of time and effort because, of course, this is sort of like a desert truck stop. They don't really see Africa as having anything particularly of value except slaves, which they're already getting into. What they basically want to do is they want to fix the ships here so they can sail to India/China, and that's where the money is. So this is a way station. The Dutch follow the Portuguese out in the 1500s, take over a lot of the Portuguese stations, and the Dutch take over this section of the southern tip of Africa, specifically Cape Town and Johannesburg. So they take over this whole section. Now, the Dutch are slightly different. Like the Portuguese, they're only interested in money. Like the Portuguese, they're only interested in India/China. But unlike the Portuguese, they find themselves in sort of an interesting situation that in many ways reflects what we'll see later with the British and the French. They have a lot of undesirables, you might call it. We're now in an earlier period. We're now in the 1600s. This is a period of very complex religious wars, Protestants versus Catholic, different groups of, anti-Catholics against each other, et cetera, et cetera. One of the conservative factions in what we now call Holland and the Netherlands is a group of sort of like the Calvinists. They're a group of very white superiority types. They're very, very fundamentalist in the classic definition we were using earlier in the semester. They see the Bible as literally being God speaking to you when you read it directly. So you don't need, and again, it's one of these sort of anti-Catholic things. So you don't need priest, you don't need absolution, you don't need any of that stuff. People have their own relationship with God, and that's what it's supposed to be. I think they're actually, I'm not sure if they're an I'm going to say they're an actual spin-off of the Calvinists, but I'm not really sure. Anyways, the thing these two groups have in common is they really can't handle anyone different than themselves. So this particular spin-off of Dutch Protestantism basically can't handle Protestants, Lutherans, Methodists, whatever. Any other version of Christianity that's slightly different than their own is totally unacceptable. So they're not willing to live with their neighbors. They, in fact, get pretty violent around it. And so what happens is basically the larger sort of Dutch collective basically tells them, well, it's been really nice knowing them, but would you please get your butt out of town? And so what happens is this particular population, this religious enclave, basically does what we call a diaspora. They literally, as a group, leave. If you want to think of a more modern version, this would be like the Church of Latter-day Saints leaving the Midwest, Iowa, or Kansas, or wherever it was for Utah. Same type of thing. They can't handle other religious groups being around them that aren't like them. So this group basically moves, and they move down here to the very southern tip of South Africa. These originally were called Boers, and I'm not sure. I knew some folks that were Afrikaner, and I can't remember exactly. They explained to me once what that means. I think it's the Dutch Reformed Church or something. I don't, go check if you're interested. That's actually what drives these folks. So they settle here. Now the Dutch government doesn't really care, because even though they're running the stations, there's very few Dutch there. They basically hire or enslave the locals to do the work. So the thing is sort of handy here. They've got a group of Dutch people that are hanging around, puttering around this part of South Africa, and that's real handy because they can't get any Dutch to migrate down there. So you can't get regular Dutch citizens to go down here, but you've got this group of religious cultist outcasts, I don't know what you want to call them, that have set up their own religious community here. And so what happens is more and more they become central to the Dutch colonial influence. And more they settle in here. More and more as they grow in numbers, they start to expand. Now, given one of the aspects of their view of religion is that only people who are Dutch are actually truly accessing God the way that they're supposed to be. So other Europeans, the British, the French and stuff, don't really count. They're like failures. Folks that are Black, in other words, anyone who isn't white, and then Dutch, by that maybe Dutch white, basically is not even considered human. So Asians, and most importantly, Africans, in the sense of the folks that, the indigenous populations of Africa, aren't seen as being human beings. They're actually seen as less than human. So this group's totally comfortable with slavery. They actually see that as part of sort of God's will. Again, the Dutch government doesn't really care because, hey, these guys are providing services. They bring in food. They help, they help some of the work in the colony, and they don't cost anything. So again, if you're trying to do this on a shoestring budget, it's fantastic. The only ones that are really unhappy about it, of course, are the indigenous populations in this part of Africa that find themselves chased off their land at gunpoint, enslaved, and basically pretty quickly this whole southern chunk of Africa becomes this weird, sort of semi-reformed church Dutch colony that really isn't controlled by government. And that's the key thing here, that the Dutch government doesn't care because they're only interested in repairing ships to get to India. So they don't care what happens in the suburbs. The Boers, who very quickly start calling themselves Afrikaners, basically start expanding through this area, largely in ranching, and also some mining and stuff like that. And again, government could give a squat. And there's no other, your indigenous populations that would be large enough or organized enough to deal with this at this particular time politically have collapsed. And so there's not really any local group that can give you a hard time. This makes it very unlike India, where you had large, political systems in place. So pretty much they can do whatever they want to. As they start to basically move up all the way through here, and through what's now Namibia, Botswana, etc. Now, 1700s, so we speed forward about 100 something years. The British and the Dutch get into one of a bunch of wars. Now, to be honest, I don't remember which one it was or what it was about. But the end result of all that is the British end up taking over the former Dutch colonies in South Africa. And so what happens is all of a sudden this place falls under British control. Now, the Dutch government's all bummed because, of course, they lost their places, but who cares? The Afrikaners initially probably don't really care because, as far as they're concerned, they didn't pay any attention to the Dutch government. And why would the British be any different? And from the British standpoint, since initially they see no value to South Africa, they've got sort of the same attitude as the Dutch government does. Hey, these guys, they're white folks, they're Christians, they're doing their thing, it's a little sketchy in terms of what they're doing, there's a little morality of it. And then the British were doing the same thing in the colonies in the Americas. So, what the hell? So initially, no one's asking any hard questions and the groups sort of get along. However, one of the huge differences between the Dutch and the British is the British can't leave well enough alone. Sooner or later, if you're a British colonial possession, they want you to turn to a real honest to God colony. That means you start speaking English, you start following British laws, et cetera, just like they do in India, North America with Canada and the American colonies, et cetera. The British have sort of like one template you have to follow. And then the Afrikaners very quickly fall afoul of each other because the Afrikaners, their whole idea of being here is you're not subject to outside control. That's why they moved, who knows, 1,500 miles away from Holland. In this regard, it's very similar if you go back and you look at your history of the Church of Latter-day Saints in Utah. Once they settle in Utah, the American government eventually sends a military expedition, I think it's in the 1850s or something, to force them to become part of the United States because they didn't want to. They moved to Utah, which no one else wanted. so they could have their own system, have their own laws, have their own government, and basically not be part of the United States. So very, very similar, much later, was the very same thing that was going on in what's now called South Africa between the Afrikaners, the Boers, and the British. Now, this could have sort of gone on a sort of low-level squabble. They get into one or two sort of small wars, but they're very quickly sort of resolved, with the exception of all of a sudden this. As they're putting around in all this area, what happens is, and if you remember, I mentioned last time that one of the things about this particular continent is the fact that a lot of it's very, very old, and that means very complex and very rich in mineral resources. Now, for most of it in the tropical belt, it's very hard even today to access. So they've got them, but it's very hard to get to them in many cases. In here, as you see, this is much drier. And so once the Boers move into this region, a fair number of them start to get involved in mining, because Kimberley is probably most famous. That's one of the world's largest diamond mines. Johannesburg is diamonds and gold. So this whole area has got a huge amount of resource wealth. Now, you've got this tension between the folks that are out here initially sort of poking around, which are these Afrikaner Boers, and the British. And we now segue into the 19th century. So now in the 1800s, especially the last part of the 19th century, you've had the gold rushes in the United States. You've had gold rushes in all sorts of mineral rushes in Canada. You've had huge mineral rushes throughout Australia, which still pretty much define Australian society today. So what you've got is in the 19th century, there's always this attitude, there's another place to make a lot of money in a hurry. And so what happens is when these finds become publicized, you'll get masses and masses of people, almost all of them British settlers, either from England or British colonial possessions, Australians, Canadians, Americans, whatever, coming in here to move into this area to make a lot of money. And when they come in, they basically bring British society in the same way that I used to do research in Virginia City in Nevada. And, that was in the middle of nowhere. But when the Americans move into that place, pretty soon it's got a main street, it's got saloons, it's got all this stuff that Americans consider normal. And that's the same thing that happens here. And of course, that immediately runs afoul of the Afrikaners, who are very much a religiously based society, which doesn't do a lot of drinking, doesn't do a lot of this and that. And so when you get the classic sort of stereotypic mining town, it's got almost nothing in common with Afrikaner values. And the Afrikaners want them out. And so the Afrikaners and the miners start getting into a shooting war, basically, because the miners are there to make money and they don't give a rat's ass what anyone thinks. And the Afrikaners, in a weird way, now this is their property. They've been there for 100, 150 years. No one's asking what the actual locals are thinking, because the Afrikaners have either enslaved or chased them off. So what you have is sort of a two-tiered society. You have a white elite, which is this Dutch migrant population. Underneath them, you've got your large majority population, which is intentionally Black, it's African. The miners end up as a third layer, sort of, coexisting, if you would, with the Afrikaners, not getting along with them. Now, the British government, of course, gets all involved in this, because the British government, who's basically down here, is going to, of course, protect the rights of British citizens, which is the miners in this case. They also, in a rather incredibly cynical and, of course, pretty honest way, given it's a colonial possession, figured that whatever's coming out of this area should be taxed, and it should belong at least in part to the government. And so very quickly the government, sticks their finger in the middle of all this and says, this has got to be under British control. They start sending troops up here. They start putting in, law offices and all this type of stuff to make it part of the British Empire, because now this is worth a lot of money. The largest diamond mines in the world, I think, still exist in South Africa. And for a while, Johannesburg was one of the largest gold mines in the world. So the British see an enormous amount of wealth suddenly showing up out here, and they're not going to let that slip through their hands. And the Afrikaners really aren't that big into gold and diamonds and stuff like that. They're more like ranching, but they want to own the land and they want to do their own thing. And if you look at the words here, you've got Kimberley, which is obviously British, but a lot of these are all Dutch words. Kiersdorp, Postrom, Rustenburg, Johannesburg, and all of a sudden you've got Centurion, Standerton. If you notice Newcastle, notice the mix of how you've got British names mixed in with Dutch names. And that sort of tells you what's going on here is the Dutch, i.e. the Boer Afrikaners, basically decide they ain't allowing this. And so they basically pull themselves out of the British Empire. You end up with absolutely totally bloody First Boer War in 1881, and then the Second Boer War in 1900. And the Boer War in 1900 was very much not only a precursor of World War I, but it was an incredibly bloody war for the British. They lost tons of troops. It was also famous as the first widespread use of modern concentration camps, where they took huge parts of the Dutch, Boer population and put them in concentration camps with mortality levels that were actually almost the same as those Nazi concentration camps, 50 years later. So it was a really, really brutal war by both sides. And the end result was when it finally sort of ends in 1903, 1904, this whole part of the world's been sort of ripped up. Now, the British end up in charge. And one of the ironies about this is right here. Where'd it go? Oh, I think it's Ladysmith. No, it was Kimberley, I think. I'm going to say Kimberley. I don't remember. Anyways, one of the guys who was in charge of the diamond mines, because the British who come in to invest in this mining industry are very clever. They've been doing this for a while, and they're basically totally sleazeballs. They're basically, Teflon covered, clever lawyer types who are very, very good at taking land from people or even just sort of stealing it and then making a gazillion dollars out of it. And the most famous is a guy named Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, who comes in, very quickly buys up, and within 10 years or something, ends up in a controlling interest in almost all the gold and especially diamonds in this particular region of South Africa. Much of it by very questionable means, even by British standards. But the thing is most of the land he's, quote, stealing, unquote, is coming from the Boers, it's coming from the Afrikaners. And so the British government doesn't really care because Cecil Rhodes is a British citizen. He's originally from London or someplace. He pays his taxes. He donates a lot to political campaigns. So he's a nice, upstanding British citizen. And of course, to the British government, the Boers Afrikaners are a bunch of, sketchy types who don't really want to back the British government. So who cares what they complain about? So this Second Boer War starts. Rhodes ends up in the middle of it because he's there at the time. Becomes a huge sort of public relations image of the British colonial control in a positive way as far as the British are concerned. When all this ends, he ends up with basically almost entire, monopoly on especially diamond production in the Southern African continent. Ironically, the name of his company is taken from part of the Dutch. It's De Beers, which is one of the Dutch guys he basically bought out. And so De Beers ends up by 1910, they've got a monopoly, and I believe something like 60 or 70% of the diamonds sold on planet Earth come from the De Beers company. It's either their own mines or they buy up the raw diamonds from someone else and finish them. Ironically, the cutting of the diamonds is still done in Amsterdam. So even though the Dutch government's long gone, Holland is actually still the center of the diamond industry, even as we speak today. De Beers still controls the vast majority of diamond production. If you buy a diamond at someplace like one of those wedding shops, that diamond is a very good chance that diamond originally was from De Beers, was wholesaled through De Beers. And that's one reason why diamonds are so expensive. They're not expensive because they're rare. They're expensive because De Beers controls production. De Beers also controls the prices since they sit on all of them. They basically decide how many they're going to hand out, so controls the prices. And that's Rhodes. Rhodes is De Beers. He becomes later famous because he becomes concerned by 1910. The publicity about how he'd taken control of this area starts to sort of spin negatively. And more he's seen as one of these classic 19th, 20th century robber barons. He decides he really wants to sort of promote a better image. So he sets up the Rhodes Foundation and the Rhodes Scholarships to basically, ironically, look at, dealing with things like, world peace and how groups can get along, political groups can get along better with each other, et cetera, et cetera. Ironically, the very opposite of what he did, because he actually, in large part, pushed the war against the Boers because he wanted to take control, financial control of South Africa. And I don't think we have any Rhodes. I'm pretty sure we don't have any Rhodes scholars right now, but they're around. UH always has a couple. So what you find, ironically, is one of the most prestigious scholarships you can get at a university as an undergraduate is a Rhodes Scholarship. And, that's basically an open door to all sorts of stuff, especially politics, political science and such like that. And the irony is what originally was, it's on blood money generated by a guy who was responsible for a huge amount of suffering and slavery and, exploitation in South Africa, who decided to do this to sort of spin a positive. And sort of the irony is it worked. People know the Rhodes, scholarships and the Rhodes Foundation. Very few people actually know about Cecil Rhodes. So the key with all this, and it's a rather long story, is that in this entire discussion, if you notice, it's the Boers and the British. The majority population of Black Africans is just, they're not at all in this discussion. In fact, the only case the Black Africans show up here is, ironically, a population of a Black African state here starts, becoming very militarized, and they end up migrating down this way to the south. These become called the Zulus, which is one of their 3 or 4 different names, and they end up crashing into both the Boers and the British. So the Boers and the Zulus go at it. I think the Zulus won 1 and the Boers won 1. And then the British and the Zulus go at it in 1879, just before the first Boer War. And the Zulus initially clean the clock of the British, and then the British at the end pretty much wipe out the Zulu army. So the end result is, ironically, is the largest political group in South Africa and the largest population group ethnically in South Africa is Zulu. But they're not actually from South Africa. They had only migrated down there in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s from basically this eastern area over here down into South Africa. So what you find even today in the country of South Africa, their single largest political social party is the Zulu, because they're still actually very organized as a political, social, cultural entity. They pretty much kept their structure that they came when they migrated down there. Your other, one of your larger political other parties, ironically, is still the Boers Afrikaners. After they lose the wars with the British, they basically decide, well, okay, we can't beat these guys, let's join them. And by 1910, 1915, the British have pretty much given over control of these colonies, which includes now Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, etc., all become under control of largely a Boer-directed or Afrikaner-run state under British governorship. So what happens by the 1920 period is that, this part of the world is back under Afrikaner control. It's with a British flag flying, but they pretty much do their own thing. Now, of course, what that also means, among other aspects, is their religious attitude towards Blacks that becomes government policy. Even though slavery is outlawed, for example, everywhere except parts of Australia until about 1910 or 1920. In South Africa, the de facto slavery is in place right into the 1950s. It's called indentured servitude, but the end result is right into the 1990s. If you were Black in this part of the country of South Africa, once it gains independence in the 50s or whatever, is basically you had to have a particular passport. If you were going to go to many areas, you had to have a permit to go into that part of the country. Now, if you were Black, if you're white, you can go anywhere. And if you're Afrikaner, of course, you own the place. This is what we call apartheid, which is basically a religiously driven segregation of people based on something. In this case, apartheid is based on physical appearance, eye race. In other places, it might be based on religion. You could argue that apartheid is actually fairly common in a lot of Eastern Europe, based on whether you're Greek Orthodox or Catholic or whatever, or Muslim, certainly. So apartheid isn't unique to the area. What makes it really interesting in South Africa is that there isn't a shared acceptance of it, and it persists right into the late 20th century, just because of the political, military, police control of your minority white Afrikaners. And basically, when this finally falls apart, you end up with a change into the modern country of South Africa, which is still having enormous political and social stresses. Because again, when you think about it, it's a really strange situation. If you live in this part of the country and you're from the original indigenous populations, you're now like the third level minority in your own place. The biggest group is the Zulus, who basically still control this whole area. And they're not from there. They're from about 500 miles up to the north. They just migrated down. So they're recent. They've only been there for 100, 150 years. And you've got the Boers Afrikaners, who of course were the ones who made this place such a nightmare if you're Black. And they're still one of the other larger groups in this particular area. And they, of course, are the most sophisticated, most educated. They still run a lot of the political governmental systems. And they're not your friend. They enslaved your family and stuff like that and controlled your lives right into 30, 40 years ago. And then you've got all the different ethnic groups who are actually the different cultures that lived in this part of South Africa before the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and the Zulus all shored up and shop and started hanging out. And now, because you've still got enormous mineral wealth here, you've got an incredibly complicated place. And that's why your Botswana Zimbabwe video is so useful. Both those places were part of the South African Afrikaner system. And if you look at that as sort of a sub-dialogue that you see when you're looking at that video, then a lot of stuff starts to make a lot of sense. absolutely fascinating example of colonialism, and very, very much what I would call the Pacific Islands African version, which is the places have no value, and if they do have value, you're so focused on the financial aspect of it, you pay absolutely no attention to the people who live there. They're not even a statistic, you know. So that's the reality of South Africa, and this plays out in a number of spots. The same thing plays out in Nigeria, French Guiana, for example. This is not unique to this area. It's just probably the best example because it's so striking. It becomes so visible in the modern world of diamonds and modern finance. It's a classic example of this whole situation.